Welcome to Black Feathers Podcast, a true and honest conversation about disabilities for all. I am your host, Dr. Crystal Hernandez from the Cherokee Nation.
And I am Shauna Humphreys from Choctaw Nation.
Today we will discuss the importance of mental health at the intersections of disability within our tribal nations. We will hear from Jonna James and her personal journey with mental health, suicide, as well as disabilities within her family. Jonna, I know you have an incredible story, and we are so thrilled to have you here, being able to share this with our listeners, as well as Shauna and myself.
Thank you guys for having me. So I do have a lot of stories that narrate my life, and one of the reasons I'm excited to share is because to me it's a roadmap that I've been given. So I'm going to start with, my name's Jonna James, Chickasaw Saye. I'm a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation. And I do a lot of things. I've worked in behavioral health. I've worked in suicide prevention. I've been an Indian child welfare caseworker. Currently, I work at a tribal serving institution where I do student recruitment, serve on the executive team for the college, as well as teach an American Indian Studies course. So again, lots of work in Indian country. But my most favorite purposes are being an Ishki and a Posi. So I get to be a mom and I get to be a grandma. I am a mom to 6 children, 5 I gave birth to and 1 that I adopted. So my 5 children by birth are Chickasaw. My adopted child is a Choctaw member. And that's what I really want to talk about today because like so many that work in the behavioral health field, you know, there's a story for my family and the path that we have been on and how that has played out for us. And I want to start with... I was married to my high school sweetheart. We got married when we were 20 years old. I did go to college, and I had planned the perfect college plan, and we had this roadmap that we had created. We started having children younger than we'd expected due to some health problems, and that I didn't want to miss my chance at being a mom. So we made the decision to go ahead and start having children when I was 21 years old. And then from there, we had 3 children in the following, our children were all 2 years apart. So I noticed with my 3rd child, there was some developmental delays. And I was thinking there cannot possibly be something wrong with all of my children. They all had some sort of struggles. The middle child at the time had a speech impediment. And so I got their doctor's records and I went through all of them and I went to their pediatrician. I said, explain all of this. And so he ran some tests and found out that my children had lead poisoning. And we had built a brand new home, so we couldn't really figure out where the lead poisoning came from. The government got involved at that point, of course, because that's what they do when lead poisoned children happen in the state of Oklahoma. And through that investigation, we found that my husband's employee at the time, there was a lead-based coolant that he was working with, and we did not know that, and that our home had become contaminated. There were a lot of people involved in our life from there. And in that journey, we found out that the lead poisoning had led to our children's developmental delays. They were seen at the OU Child Study Center, and all 3 of them received autism diagnosis. So at that time, it was called pervasive development disorder, not otherwise specified. And our 3rd child, the one that was struggling so much, had a IQ that made her borderline, and so she was going to have lifelong struggles. We were devastated, of course, but we got intervention. We got therapists. We did parent-child interaction therapy. We did everything that was available. That child's 18 now. They just turned 18 actually August 2nd. And so, but we got all of the interventions and services that was available 15 years ago to help these kids and help us. And I want to say right off the bat, with the children receiving their diagnosis early on, my thought process was not that these diagnoses were about what was wrong with my children. It was, for me, an explanation of how my children navigate this world, and my job going forward as their mom was going to be to learn their navigation maps. They just see the world in a different, and what I have learned, beautiful way than I and most people do. So we went on to have, we adopted a child and then had 2 more children. We just went on as the normal family, trying to navigate life as you do. But then in 2013, we lost my mother to suicide. And so again, we sought out behavioral health services. We had were members of the Chickasaw Nation who did an amazing job coming in and helping our family. We had coordinated services for the children to help them navigate all things school, because when a trauma like that, it really rocks every area of your life, is what we learned. I noticed that my youngest child continued to have struggles, continued to have outbursts, continued to have behavioral health struggles, continued to have school struggles. And the more they struggled, the more behavioral health services we reached out for. One of the things about this my youngest is they were always super smart, and so to me, I didn't understand, everything that we were trying, nothing seemed to be working. And then last December, we went to a psychologist, and I was devastated when my 14-year-old, she was 14 at the time, was diagnosed with level 2 autism. What had happened was, because I was a mom to 3 other autistic children, I had just intervened in my youngest child's. Every time I saw them struggle, I would, adjust and do the things that I learned early on. And what happened is, between my child masking and my own personal interventions, we just went undiagnosed. One of the things that they had that was really a struggle was, they would always tell me, they would get upset and overwhelmed and they couldn't tell me what was going on. And they would say, "Mom, I want to tell you, I just can't talk." They said that so many times. And what I was hearing was, I don't know how to share my emotions, or maybe I'm an introvert. That's what I thought for the longest time, that this 6th child out of this family of extroverts was an introvert. These are the things I was thinking all of this time. And what we found out during their diagnosis is, when they are in overwhelm, they go nonverbal. They literally are not able to talk. This explains so much. It explained why in therapy, when we would get to the hard things, they would not be able to talk. And what we were saying was, well, they're shutting down. They're shutting down their emotions. They're not able to share with us. We didn't realize that they, in that moment, were nonverbal and unable to communicate with us. And this is the story I want to share. I want to share because I feel like, especially in my interactions with Crystal, we have talked about, or Dr. Hernandez, my apologies, what we've talked about is the intersection of autism and behavioral health services. And what does that mean? And that was one of the things the psychologist helped us navigate in December, was to find a therapist that knows how to navigate autism, because people with autism need different approaches sometimes so that their therapy will work. Sometimes regular talk therapy or CBT therapy is not what's appropriate for them. And that's another thing I learned with all of my children. Even though they have these autism diagnoses, they each still operate and navigate life differently. Like, just because there's 5 children with autism diagnosis does not mean I have 5 children that all act the same way. They each have different behaviors, and again, different roadmaps in how they learn and how they communicate. And so that's just where we're at today. And I had to work through a lot of guilt as a mom, not recognizing what was going on with my youngest child until they were 14 years old. And now I've had others also share their experience of not being diagnosed with autism until later in life. And I'm not there yet. I will be in October. But what I learned through my children also is some of the things that I do are also traits of autism. And so I do have that evaluation in October, and that has taken a year to get to that because there's just not enough services out there. And even for adults, those services were set out for a year and a half. And so learning if some of these things are also kind of what's going on, or maybe there were some things that made more sense in my childhood that didn't make sense then. And so we're exploring that path as well. But I've had to reconcile with myself as a mom what I didn't know. And I have a friend that's Choctaw that works in behavioral health, and she had told me many years ago when I was first working a suicide prevention grant, I met her, and there were some things I was going to be learning that I did not know, and I had already lost my mom to suicide, and she shared with me, you're going to hear some things that you did not know when you lost your mom, and it may make you feel some kind of way, like, oh, why didn't I see that? Like, one of the things was maybe that people that are struggling with suicidal ideation may start giving their belongings away, and that was the case with my mom. She'd given away some of her jewelry. But the advice my friend had given me at the time was, as you're learning these things, there's a Maya Angelou quote she wanted me to remember, and it was, we do the best we can until we know better. And then when we know better, we just do better. And I hang on to that quote. I have through this journey of the last 10 years working with my family as we have tried to find balance and healing. We can't go back to the past and change some things, but we can, as we learn to do better, we can do better. And that is also what has inspired me to share our story, because I learned better by those that were willing to share with me. And so if it can help somebody else that's struggling with autism and struggling with healing, however you're seeking those services, to just know not to give up. We just have to find the roadmap to how we navigate and how our children navigate things until we find what works.
Thank you for sharing that, Jonna. It was very insightful and brave, and I know we've shared, you and I together, a lot of pieces of our children's stories, and we have worked in those cross sections of mental health as well as intellectual and developmental disability spaces. So I do have a question for you. So you talked about how you navigated those interventions early on. Did you find any gaps or any opportunities within your tribe that really understood developmental disabilities or screenings or any of those things? Or do you think that we've evolved and grown over the 2 decades?
We have certainly grown. And unfortunately, it was not on my, I didn't think to reach out to my tribe at that time. So we went through local services, and I feel like the local services were great, but back then it was mostly parent-child interaction therapy, and I think that's important, because the difference in those, from my experience, and the difference in those is when we did parent-child interaction therapy, it was we would all sit in a room, and I would sit in there with my children, and they would behave a certain way, and then they would teach me how to react to them or interact with them based on their different behaviors. And for example, the child that had the speech impediment, so she has autism but also has a diagnosis of apraxia. And so, navigating how to communicate with that child, teaching them some sign languages. And so those were some of the things I was taught then. What I see now, it's more of a person-centered approach where they're working with the person with autism. And I think that that's more appropriate, because you can't go through life with my children. Like, I can't always be there to hold their hand and navigate for them. They deserve to know how to navigate situations themselves, more working directly with the autistic person and teaching them social interactions, how to cope. We're doing that with my 14-year-old right now. When they go into overwhelm, and both how they're interacting with the people around them when they're in overwhelm, and how they are interacting inside themselves, because their narrative in the past towards themselves when they couldn't interact was, there's something wrong with me and I must be worthless. And now they're learning, I'm in overwhelm right now, and I deserve to be calm, and I deserve to take my time and do whatever it takes to be calm. I can remove myself from the situation. All of the things they're learning to be easier on themselves. And so I feel like we've come a long ways. I feel like uh, the approach does need to be aimed at helping the autistic person take care of themselves and also not to change them. My children will always be autistic. There's not a cure for autism. And so to teach them to be successful in this world as they are, I think is just one of the best things that has changed and could have happened.
Absolutely. So you said two things I just want to circle back on. You talked about becoming nonverbal, and so we look at a lot of the research and the data, specifically related to the autistic population, and that 50% on average are nonverbal and really non-speaking, right? And then during times of distress or stress, they an additional portion of them lose that ability to verbalize. And so when I say that, it doesn't take away all the other methods of communication that they do have at their disposal and that they do often use. And so what I'm talking about is traditional expected verbal ability. And so we do know that. And you mentioned that, so I just wanted to kind of chime in on that. And the other thing that you mentioned was the intersection of mental illness and autism. And so again, looking at a lot of that statistic and that research, it talks about the presence of 78% co-occurring rate among those two populations. And so a lot of our traditional mental health systems do not account for autistic individuals, meaning that they don't understand, they lack the training, they lack the sophistication and policy to really have equity and to understand that they should, could, and it's imperative that they serve this population.
Absolutely. And we have dealt with a wide range of behavioral health issues among all of the children. So I don't want to talk about any of them specifically. That's their own story. But for some of the things that we have seen include depression. They have included self-harm. Um, they have included anxiety. And I feel like there is a direct correlation between the traumatic experience of being autistic in a world that doesn't make space for autistic people. Um, the dialogue that they have shared with me, um, based on interactions like they've had at school, and even how maybe some of their own educators have talked to them or treated them or used the wrong word in front of them. And then they've internalized that story. And that is one thing about children is they will make up a narrative if we're not helping them. And sometimes that can be a very negative narrative, and that's traumatic. When you go through life thinking, I'm worthless, or I'm weird, or I'm not accepted, or I don't have any friends, or one of my children really struggled with making friends, and they said, "Mom, I just want one friend." And that broke my heart. Um, so yes, I feel like so many of their struggles on the behavioral health side and mental illness, they're locked in their own world trying to navigate, and we just have to do better, I think, to help them so it's not so traumatic for them. That's something we can do, is take some of that on for them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you mentioned a few times some of the work that you've done in the field of suicide, in the area of suicide, and also some personal experience with that. And so our autistic community is at a massively higher rate of suicidal ideation and contemplation, as well as completed suicides. And again, oftentimes they're left out of prevention efforts. They're left out of any kind of marketing campaign, any sort of, place within the suicide prevention world. And so that's another area we can definitely do better and should do better. So I just want to bring you back to real quick the tribal systems, because I know you didn't use them with your kiddos, but moving forward, you definitely work among tribal nations routinely. And so what do you see in terms of the behavioral health space, the mental health space, even the autistic space within the tribal nations that you have work with and have knowledge of?
So I will say in the last 10 years, we have accessed our behavioral health resources through our tribe, and they have been amazing. They're the ones that stepped in to help the kids after my mom's suicide loss. Um, and what I see with all of our tribes, I see that well, I'll say on a federal level, starting with we have these Native Connections grants. I was in that field working with the tribe when the Native Connections grants were created back in, I want to say that would probably have been 2015 or 16. And we have more funding services and sources, and our tribes are really able to reach their community members, especially through the Native Connections grant, which is a really community centered grant. And so I see our tribes being innovative. I I brag on them all of the time, especially in Oklahoma, because those are the ones that I do see their stories. There's one tribe that is using stickball as prevention, and the way that they explain that to me is they're teaching their children how to be part of their indigenous community by playing stickball with them. They're teaching them what a leader looks like, what a team player looks like. So they're using a game, but at the same time being intentional to teach that child how to be included in community and how to include others. And I think that's just beautiful. We know that our culture is prevention. Um, I have heard, I was told that, culture is like a fish in water. The fish doesn't realize it lives in water until you take it out. And I feel like culture is that way for our people. You don't realize how important it is until you're not in it. And so that's what I mostly appreciate with the tribes, and how they are reacting to all things behavioral health right now, is that focus on community and belonging and taking part in your indigenous ways. So I'm grateful to both all our tribes that were at those consultations, as well as the agencies within the state of Oklahoma that made that possible, so that our autistic children have access to services. So I see our tribes out there constantly trying to make it better.
Perfect. So I know Shauna does a tremendous amount of work within her tribal mental health systems. And so I'm just curious, Shauna, what are your thoughts about the stories that we just heard, and kind of, how we've evolved as tribal nations, and the focus and emphasis that we have now moving forward on wellness and how we perceive mental health and those intersections?
Yeah, so a couple of things come to mind. First of all, Jonna, it's a pleasure to have you, and I know we've done work together in suicide prevention in the past. And that's kind of where part of my journey started with suicide prevention, was working alongside Jonna. And at that time, I believe it was the Wichita affiliated tribes that Jonna was working for, and we were both doing the SAMHSA GLS, the Garrett Lee Smith suicide initiative. But one thing to me culturally, culture is prevention. I love how you said that, Jonna, and Track Donation is one of those that is using stickball as prevention to give that sense of belonging, but also the storytelling. So what you just did right now, culturally, this is how we learn. This is how we spread awareness, and this is how we carry our traditions, is by storytelling. I feel like the tribes have really come a long way, just like Jonna said. In as our work both in mental health and with autism, we're still a long way to go. But I feel like when I first started back with behavioral health, I guess that's been about 8 years ago. Always been in the mental health field, but back with the actual department, behavioral health with Chalk Donation, we didn't really have a whole lot of. We had some programs going out into the community, kind of helping spread awareness. But really with the Tomorrow's Hope grant is where I noticed some systems change occurring. Like we started screening people that come into the clinic using PHQ-9s in the Columbia, because we knew that not everyone would set foot at the behavioral health buildings. And so it's like, how do we truly, help people and meet them where they are? And so it's like, well, let's go to them and provide that holistic care. And so now we've seen integrated starting to occur. Then that kind of happened through part of the Native Connections grant that Jonna was talking about. And I just continue to see the vision for our tribes grow and grow. and tap into that culture as prevention. Because, like I just said, whenever you're integrated, you're treating not just the physical piece, but now that we're screening for suicide and for depression, you're treating the mental health piece. And so, mind, body, soul, we're kind of getting that connection and truly meeting people where they're at. Creating harmony is also kind of what I say. But that's kind of what I've been noticing and what I've encountered over the years. And I just hope to see it continue to grow.
So you both have mentioned connectedness and kind of that connectivity. And, as we embrace a connected view as people, we draw on our ancestors, our community, our stories, our customs, our history, in all of this can and does shape our world, right? Our perceptions and our people as a whole. And it's these very elements that often serve as protective factors. And that's what people oftentimes don't talk about, among our tribes, is that we have a tremendous amount of protective factors, which explain and highlight our resiliency as people and our strength. And this really does shine the light on the incredible strides we have seen among our tribal nations as we have grown and placed a strong emphasis on mental health. You see tribal nations stepping forward saying, we are going to allocate, we are going to build, we want to be at the table, and we want our people to thrive and be healthy. And that's fantastic.
So I want to tell another story. I should have invited her with me. She's not here today, but my 20-year-old, she was 13 at the time she lost her grandmother, so a real significant age, and she was close to my mother. And Chickasaw Nation helped her through her behavioral health journey, and they did a commercial with her. She worked hard at her healing, and she also has an autism diagnosis, and then she went on to become a mentor for We Are Native, which is a national organization for Native youth, and she was an ambassador. So they choose 30 ambassadors in the United States, and she was chosen to be one of them. And then she went on to college last year. It was her first year in college, and she knows she's autistic. She's always done whatever help has been provided. She takes it for all it's worth, and does everything she can to implement those coping skills. And so going through the Chickasaw Nation Behavioral Health, she was taught a lot. She was taught about beading while she was doing her therapy, and she was taught the connection to our ancestors, and just real connected to her culture. And so she remains connected to her culture today, and still now she's out speaking to others about generational trauma, and so super proud of her journey. But last year she was struggling at college, and she called me and she said, Mom, I went outside and I saw the Teata statue. So Teata Fisher was a storyteller for the Chickasaw Nation, and you can watch the movie over Teata. She was an amazing role model, and she went to USAO when it was Oklahoma College for Women, and that is the college my daughter goes to. And she said, Mom, it was hard, and I just was ready to quit. And I walked outside and I saw Teata's statue today, and I remembered that if she can do this, so can I. And I said, Alyssa, this is exactly why we get to do what we do. And I'm, like I said, I'm so proud of her. She does the children's conference every year for the Oklahoma Department of Mental Health. She has definitely gone on to share her story in so many spaces. But I just want to share that because it goes to talk about that connection and how empowering and healing it can be when it, just give it to them. I mean, somebody took the time to give all of this to her, and she has just run with it, and now she's getting to impact others. And so yeah, there's definitely a connection there, and the more connected we are, I feel like the better chance our children have of succeeding.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. She sounds like such a tremendously strong woman, and I bet you're so happy as a mom to see that in her.
I am, and not just as a mom, but I think one of my favorite things about being a mom is learning, like the journey of being a parent is to watch your children find who they are. And so I have some kids that, their native identity is not right at the top. They all know they're Chickasaw, but that's not, but for this one it is. But I see that, you know, especially with autistic children, helping them each find their own thing. One's into astronomy. One has become is a stagehand on a a drama production at school. Helping them each plug into their thing and watching them just bloom. And I've seen that with her, and I'm excited and honored to get to watch the rest of them grow up. And I think that's just also been key to their success is finding where their passion is at and just encouraging that. I was thinking after Crystal had said about the high suicide rates with autistic people. So, very gently, I want to say about autism and my experience with working with youth with autism is the literal nature of how they process. And so, also having that suicide prevention background. And so, I've had a youth tell me when we were having a conversation about suicide, them saying, I can suicide if I want to, it's my body. And I think that that's something we have to take into consideration with our youth that are autistic. And I think this is why the CAMS model is so important. We have to understand that, yes, suicide can happen. And when you are a person that processes everything literal.
So what we see a lot of times is individuals who are autistic, yes, they're all very different from one another, but some of the commonalities that we see is the way that they do process the literal nature of the world. And I talk about this quite often, that we have a world that was created by people with so many vast differences, including individuals who were autistic, that really shaped our sciences, our arts, our music, our philosophies, but yet our world doesn't embrace them and doesn't include them. And so there's a lot of pressure on folks. And so you have differences. So you have some people who have the anxiety, have the depression, who have that exhaustion from masking constantly, of trying to be what the world wants. And then you have the other that you just mentioned about that literal nature of process, that I make these decisions because I can. And I was at a meeting for autism at the state capitol, and it was really about raising action and awareness and inclusion, and it was a virtual one due to COVID that year, and we had a tremendous amount of representation of autistic adults on that virtual meeting, and the topic of suicide was brought up. And it was one of those moments where they were referencing having an autistic adult meeting with various members from various places, and that overwhelmingly the number of hands that went up when they were asked how many of you contemplated taking your life was overwhelming and frightening. But again, it goes back to, we are not learning and we are not growing and we are not evolving the way that we do suicide prevention, and we have to.
I think that you said that so very well and completely. We have to look at how others process things and make sure that we are developing goals and initiatives that are adjusted to their way of life. Because my experience with my autistic children is they have beautiful navigation systems, but they're different. And so therefore they require some different services and different approaches, and they deserve that. And so I'm with you on that. I think that we have a long way to go. And it starts with this awareness that we need more services that are appropriate to those that just navigate life differently than the rest of us.
And imagine all of that, what we just discussed with those different roadmaps, those different systems, those different navigation systems, and throw in the fact that some of us are within tribal nations navigating, trying through that system when we're getting roadblocked in addition to those roadblocks. And so it's a double walk,
I agree. And I think on the other side of that is for those that are indigenous that maybe don't have access to their tribal behavioral health, they're not close by, or those services aren't available. So they're having to operate within systems where they're not getting the most culturally appropriate services that can recognize historical trauma. So yeah, there's lots of layers to that. And I think it's just time to start becoming aware of some of those so we can address them.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Jonna, for sharing all of your stories and for having an open and honest conversation with us about your family and yourself, really. And I think that everything that you do, personally and professionally, just shapes and helps so many people. So thank you so much for everything that you do. I am who I was created to be. If I was meant to be someone or something else, the great Creator would have made me such. He put within me certain gifts, such as my heart, my mind, my senses, and my soul. I am who I was created to be. This is an unknown Native chief. We talked a lot about mental health and navigating some systems today. And I want to talk about some barriers. And again, when we talk about tribal nations, some are very different from others, and some have different geographical barriers, some have funding barriers, some have more opportunities. And so we're just going to talk about some generalized kind of barriers, that are often mentioned in any publication, any sort of presentation. And it talks about, those inadequate funding and coverage issues, as well as a traditional mistrust related to that historical trauma. And the big one I want to talk about is the lack of cultural respect and true inclusion. Sometimes you'll hear them talk about cultural competency. But really what it boils down to is a lack of inclusion and a lack of representation. And so we don't have a lot of mental health providers who are representing our tribal nations as people and then subsequently as professionals. And we do see that oftentimes mentioned as a substantial barrier that kind of lends to all the things, the lack of understanding, the mistrust, and kind of that dismissive sometimes nature. What do you think about that?
So you're spot on there. Like just thinking about behavioral health with my tribe, which is Choctaw Nation, there's some of us that are tribal, proud Choctaw tribal members that did go to school to become, counselors and be in the profession, but we still have quite a few that are not. The beautiful thing I've noticed with my tribe, though, is that they're all willing to learn. And so it starts kind of with providing that education to them, how a historical trauma is still in play today and those kinds of things. To me, one of the biggest barriers, besides making sure we provide that education, is the rural nature of the Choctaw Nation. So we're the southeastern, 10.5 counties of Oklahoma, very rural. I often joke, like where I live, it's an hour in either direction just to your nearest Walmart. And so like being able to get to your nearest clinic isn't always just right down the road like a lot of people picture. And so that rural area definitely plays a factor, both with getting to care and then, being rural. There's also limited Wi-Fi service and those kinds of things in our area. I go to my grandma's this day, and she lives in Smithville, Oklahoma, which most people may not even heard of, but there is no cell phone service. Like I get to her house, and I just don't expect to get a call or a text until I'm back in the range of cell service. So there's just a lot of different factors that come into play with living in a rural area, and that to me is probably one of the biggest things.
Absolutely. I know a lot of colleagues throughout the different tribal nations, and they talk about that, rural nature or the lack of transportation or connectivity. A lot of us take for granted picking up a smartphone or jumping on our computers or tablets, and that's not what everybody, wakes up to. A lot of folks don't have that capability, especially during the COVID-19, when the world really went to telehealth, when we went to televaluations and teletherapy, and we seem to forget that not everybody has that opportunity. And what we see is a huge gap and divide and, in that accessibility and that service level. And, we know what COVID did to the world, the isolation, the cutoff, the trauma the collective trauma, the anxiety and depression, the suicidal rates that we've, witnessed, and just some of the domestic violence and abuse and all sorts of things. And then factor in being cut off from, traditional therapeutic, services that some folks might have relied on, or even medications. And then we wonder why tribal nations have stepped forward and said, no one's going to help us, we're going to help ourselves. And so we've seen a tremendous amount of initiatives going forward, not just with implementing, their own behavioral health and mental health services, but also trying to figure out how to connect our folks that live out in areas that don't have connectivity with Wi-Fi. And so you see a lot of infrastructure emphasis on both sides of that equation.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And yeah, COVID really did highlight that. And, as tribes, we're a very collective culture. So, we get together as families any chance we get. And it's not just close, immediate family, like, extended family. We all get together at great grandma's house, for instance. And a lot of it centered around food and laughter. And during COVID, nobody could meet with their families. But for tribes, we're collective, and we're always used to having several people around us. It definitely highlighted that. And one thing I was going to add on the piece about food, in my experience with grants, and everything, that's one thing that always is kind of hard for me to wrap my mind around. Like, I understand federal funding and things like that, but when you provide federal funding for a tribe, like one way that we show love and respect to each other is by feeding one another, or at least my family does that. But most grants do not allow the purchase of food and things like that. And so I'm not necessarily complaining about that, and I do understand how federal funds work, but at the same time, it's like, if we're wanting to be a little more culturally appropriate with different things and have that awareness, food is a big part of who we are as well.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, Shauna, because that's a constant area of concern that is raised when I talk to various tribal nations, is that the funding is available, but there's so many gaps in their understanding of how our culture actually works and the things that would actually work to get to the heart of the information needed to build systems for folks to use appropriately, And so it kind of goes back to the things that are built, and then they get mad or expect us to use, but they're not built with us, for us, in mind, And so there's barriers, automatic barriers that kind of go up, instead of realizing that our people are uniquely different sometimes, and what might work for one group might not work for the other. And so that flexibility and that understanding that you mentioned is so important. And I'm hoping that we are moving towards shifting that understanding and really creating meaningful systems that work. So I do want to talk, Shauna, if we can, about stigma, because we know when people are going to access services, specifically related to mental health, a lot of times we still have that stigma of going through those doors. And I know that you were mentioning that earlier, they might not want to go to behavioral health. They might not want to be seen at behavioral health buildings and those types of things. And so stigma, has been a heavy focus for everyone in kind of combating that and really moving us towards a place where we can see mental health the same way that we see physical health. We go to doctors for checkups. When we have a cold or flu, we go to the doctor. We need vaccination, we go to the doctor, whatever. And so that is still not the same for mental health service. We still have that stigma of, I'm going to be seen, I'm going to be judged, they won't understand, or that embarrassment or fear or whatever, tacked onto that historical trauma, that, gap in service, that, transportation issue, the lack of representation or whatever. And so that compounding stigma for our people among tribal nations that are seeking mental health services is real, and it's really large and deep.
It is. It's very real. And sometimes I think some of the thinking behind it is that, I'm having to reach out for help. Because our culture is kind of based on strength and, like you said, taking care of things ourselves. And so I think for some, it's also just the fact that they're having to reach out for help. They don't want to have to do that, even though it's so necessary, sometimes in life. But yes, the stigma is very real. And one thing that I will say that seems to be helping break that stigma is that integrated care service that I talked about earlier. It's where a counselor comes in to the visit with you when you go to the doctor. We have a lot more people open about that and talking to a counselor while they're at the doctor, kind of treating, all three in one place. But it still doesn't make up for the fact of like going to the behavioral health clinic for other services. There you're being screened, kind of giving some really brief solution focused coping skills and tools. But really that long-term care and treatment still occurs in the behavioral health building. But reaching out for help is never a sign for weakness. But for some, and especially for our culture, in some ways it is seen that way. If you or someone you know is experiencing a mental health crisis, call the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, which provides confidential 24/7 support by dialing 988.
Join us next time for a discussion of developmental disabilities and hear stories from our wonderful guest. So, Black Feathers Podcast is a podcast that will occur on a monthly basis. We hope that you will listen, subscribe, and follow us on social media. Thank you to Cherokee National Treasure, Tommy Wildcat, for the use of your flute music on this podcast.
I want to thank Lucas Frazier and the boys for letting us use their drumming music. Please subscribe to Black Feathers Podcast. You can find us wherever podcasts are found.
We would love to hear from you and invite you to submit your stories and questions. Until next time.
Thank you for joining us on this month's journey. Remember, none of us walk this alone. Together, we are stronger, and it is the roots that bind us. Follow us on blackfeathers.org.